Hey, hi, hello, it's me again, the funny audiobook man. Today I'm coming to you with another brand new audiobook, and it's been a while. I mean, the next Fazbear Fright book isn't coming out for still, 2 months, but I figured, I have something else that I can do. See, on my Discord server of my main channel, link in the description, by the way, probably, maybe, we did a little contest. And on the Discord server, we had a bunch of people, who would write stories, and then I would judge them and decide, who's the best and who is just awful. I'm kidding. They were all actually really good. I didn't know we had such proficient writers in my server, but I had to choose a winner, and I did. And the prize was an audiobook of their FNAF story on this channel. I would have done it on my first channel, but YouTube really hates audiobooks. That's why I had to delete the other ones off of there in the first place. And so I've just kind of put them on this throwaway channel, which, cool. I'm not sure why everyone's subscribing to this one, but whatever. So yeah, I'm doing an audiobook of that story, which is called Into Madness. And by the way, if you want to read the original story, or any of the other stories submitted, go to the Discord server. Again, link in the description, or you can find it on my main channel. It's basically in every video description. So you can go there, you can go here, but either way, today I'm going to be reading Into Madness by Jack Afton, if that's even your real name, Jackaroony. Alright, enough talking, let's, talk. Never mind. Into Madness. George finally woke up, feeling intense pain at the back of his head and a warm liquid, of which he had correctly assumed to be blood, running down his neck. He tries to reach for the injury. Suddenly, a voice that startled him called out,
"Careful. I would be very mindful of my movements if I were you."
George could see why. Or, rather, he could not. "Where am I? What is this?" he asked, his voice shaking. The man in front of him stepped closer. George looked up to discover a wide grin on the man's face.
Madness.
George had never been much of a lucky person, and he knew that. However, he never needed luck to be happy. All he did need was the love of his life, Cindy, and his best friends around in order to achieve his true happiness. Unfortunately for him, though, he had already lost all of that with the death of his beloved. Losing her was what turned him from the always optimistic young lad to the bitter and depressed man he is now. Grieving over the love of his life, he had shut himself out of the caring environment his friends had become for him, replacing them with the sweet escape of reality that alcohol had been for him. And to make things worse, it was his new friend that had gotten himself into his current predicament. Just as expected from his bad luck. Since his loss, he had nothing better to do in life than going to the same bar every day to drink his sorrows away. On that very fateful day, where he thought that nobody on earth could ever understand his pain, he met him, just sitting there. A skinny man with a blank expression whose eyes already told George enough. This man had suffered the same way he had. George has always had a talent of recognizing how people really felt. You couldn't deceive him with a simple, "I'm fine," really. That talent had made him a very empathetic person. He simply couldn't stand seeing those around him in pain, which is why he approached the man. "Hey man," he said, "would you mind if I took a seat?"
"Not at all. Go right ahead."
The man had answered with a sad smile on his face. "So," George started, "what kind of problems are you trying to drink away?" he asked the man, without looking at him.
Madness. My friend, my business partner, is responsible for a fatal injury my child has endured. His very life is on the line, and there's nothing nothing I can do."
"That's horrible," George said, with a shocked expression on his face.
Yeah, it is. It is horrible, and everyone has already lost hope. Even my wife has given up, and what's even worse is that my business partner just continues working like nothing ever happened. You must have apologized 1,000 times already, and yet despite hearing it again and again and again, I still haven't sensed any source of remorse in him when he did. I'd do anything just to bring him back, to put him back together.
The man's explanation became more and more aggressive and angered as he keeps going, until the end where all he seemed to be was sad and frustrated. "I'm sorry, I can't imagine the pain you must feel at this moment, considering your partner's betrayal, but I certainly know how it feels to lose someone. My girlfriend Cindy, I lost her due to cancer. Right before I would have attempted to propose to her, too. If I would have just noticed something sooner, she'd probably still be alive. I can't help but feel responsible, at fault for her departure. Every day I wake up with the hopes of her lying next to me. Every time I look in the mirror, I just wish to see her behind me, but I never do. No matter how hard I try to believe she'd survive, no matter how hard I try to believe in a happy ending, it just doesn't happen. It's not fair. I just want to have her back in my life. I'd be willing to believe anything if it meant I'd see her again," George answered, feeling the same bitterness he always felt when he thought about his deceased beloved. This time, however, it was not the only thing he had felt. He felt a bitterness, sure, but he also felt a sign of relief. Since he lost Cindy, he'd never told anyone how he truly felt. He never had the opportunity to just vent his true emotions, and now that he finally had acquired the chance, it had become less bitter. For the very first time, it had been bittersweet. Not a big change, to be sure, but it at least had been a change, and George knew that.
I am so sorry for your loss, friend. Well, I'll have to go now, while I'm still sober enough to drive. See you around,"
said the man, while standing up and putting on the hat he had undoubtedly come with. "All right, well, see ya," George replied. After paying for his drink, the unknown man had left the bar. How weird. I forgot to ask him for his name, George thought. But since he didn't tell him his either, he had just brushed it off. After finishing his drink and paying for it, he had left the establishment too. Despite everything having been quite normal, from the drinks he'd usually order to the people who had been in the bar, there was still something on George's mind. Something was off. Was it something he saw? Was it something he heard? Or rather, was it something he did not hear? Since there didn't seem to be much of a problem, he just brushed it off and went home. The next day he woke up and went through his usual routine of feeling miserable. After many hours of lying in bed with yet another painful realization of the fact that his beloved wasn't there next to him, he decided that it was time to drink his sorrows away again. Going on his way to the same old bar as every other day in his routine, he felt different. Instead of feeling nothing but despair, there was a small spark of hope this time. Hope that the mysterious man from last night would be there again. He was the only one who could actually comprehend his pain, after all. Entering the bar, he was disappointed to see that he hadn't been around. Going back to feeling miserable, he had taken a seat and prepared to order. "What'll it be tonight, sir?" the bartender had asked him. "Just pour me some Jack Daniels as always, Lloyd," he answered. "Very well, sir," Lloyd said, while taking a glass and filling it with the drink George had ordered. And so he spent hour after hour after hour, knocking back one drink after another until he felt drunk enough to not have to think. To think about her, to think about them, to think about anything at all. But that wouldn't make him feel any better. All it did was delaying the inevitable, and he knew that. All he did was wasting time. After spending a few more hours trying to get sober enough to actually make it to his home, he gets up, pays for his drinks, and was ready to go home, just to do it all over again, when he'd wake up in the morning. Going out of the building, he couldn't help but thinking about her again. The way they just lie in bed, happy, with their eyes closed and smiles on their faces, whispering each other's name. "Cindy," George whispered to himself, in hopes of hearing her sweet voice replying with George. He looked up, his eyes widened, wondering if what he just heard was his drunk brain and taking a toll on him, or whether he actually heard what he thought, what he hoped, what he was scared of thinking and hoping. He waited a few moments in hopes of hearing it again. "Cindy?" he said, with a shaking voice. "George, help me!" he heard again, echoing. He looked in front of him, trying to find out where the call for help had come from. He looked to the right. There he saw an old run-down house, which looked like it hadn't been inhabited for years. "Cindy?" he cried out. "Help me!" he heard again, this time calmer and more monotone. It also sounded like it had come from the left this time, without any distance at all. Ignoring that, George rushed over to the old house, calling out, "Cindy! I'm coming!" There it was again. The odd feeling of something not lining up. He still wasn't sure what it had been that was on his mind the other day, and he already managed to find a seemingly new discrepancy. This time, however, he seemed to actually notice what didn't seem right. This house, he thought. Has it always been here? He finished. That doesn't matter, he said to himself. I need to find her, he thought. He ran after a bunch of trees and bushes, and after a few steps more, he finally reached the run-down house. Its door stood wide open. Not thinking, he ran inside. After a few more steps, he stopped. He was surrounded by pure darkness and couldn't see a thing. Damn it, he thought. How am I supposed to find her if I can't see anything? Just my luck. He turned around, looking down in anger and shame as he realized that he would have to find a flashlight first. He approached the door and prepares to get out so that he can run back home and return fast enough to find his beloved. Just as he tries to touch the door, he gets interrupted by a deafening cry for help, echoing in the halls as the door in front of him slams itself closed. George remains in the same pose he had just been before the cry for help. He feels paralyzed. That cry, he whispers to himself, in the other direction. Finding his beloved before it's too late is all on his mind. Running further and further into the dark abyss that lied ahead, purple fog seemed to manifest around him. He continues running and hears something. It sounds like a kid crying. As much as he wanted to help the kid, he continued running. He needed to keep running. I'm so sorry, but I need to find her. It can't be late. Not again, he whispered to himself, addressing the kid, who couldn't have been older than 12, knowing very well that he can't hear him. As he takes one step after another, he slowly begins to feel dizzy. He stops and raises his hand to take a good look at it. His vision is getting blurry too. Brushing it off as unimportant, he keeps running. He didn't care about any discomfort he would have to endure, as long as he could save the love of his life. He runs as fast as he can, but something feels wrong. His mind. It feels as if his very thoughts might be slipping away. But that wouldn't stop him from running, as he sees a glimmer of light emerge under what appears to be a door. Just a few more steps, he's thinking, as his memory of what he's doing here slowly fades away. He finally gets to the door and opens it. He slowly approaches one of the stools and takes a seat. What'll it be today, George? The man behind the counter asks, facing the shelves, on which the drinks had been stored. Bourbon, please, George replied. Of course, said the man behind the counter in a mocking way. Of course. This is all your life has become now, isn't it? He continued. I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, George said. Of course you don't. You aren't even trying to understand. You haven't been trying to understand anything for a while now. For almost a year, in fact. No, you were way too busy drinking your sorrows and pain away in the same bar for every damn day to even think about understanding what you've done. What are you talking about? Who are you? George asked, his anger raising. So you truly have forgotten about me, about us, replied the man after slamming his hands on a small desk in front of him. Well, I guess that's to be expected of you after abandoning us without any second thoughts while we were only trying to help, he continued, while slowly turning around, revealing his face to George. No, that's impossible. Leon, George exclaimed, with a shocked expression on his face. Oh, so you do remember me, huh? What an honor, Leon said. How? George asked. How do you find me? George asked, enraged. Now, that's not the right way to talk to an old friend now, is it? Leon asked, with a more passive-aggressive-looking smile on his face. After all, it was you that abandoned us, wasn't it? George remained silent. See, now that's better. And to answer your question, let's just say that it seems like you can't just run away from your problems, just like we tried to tell you, he answered in a calm tone. Too calm to be friendly. Ironic, isn't it? He said, while leaning closer to George. After all this time, trying to run away from your problems, you just ran into your biggest problem yet, and there's no way out of this time, he continued, while getting even closer, close enough to be having direct eye contact to George. It's your fault, you know, Leon said, followed by a loud sound which seemed familiar to a heartbeat. You could have done something. Ba-dump. There it was again, this time louder. You should have done something. Ba-bump. You knew what she was going through. Ba-bump. And you decided to do absolutely nothing. Ba-dump. And then you just conveniently decided to deny the truth. Ba-dump. Ba-dump. No. You kept telling yourself lies to make yourself feel better. Ba-bump. Ba-bump. No! Please stop! Ba-bump. And to make things even worse, you even started drinking, just so you wouldn't even be capable of giving yourself the chance to realize the truth, let alone accept it. Ba-dump, ba-dump, ba-dump. "That's not true," George said while he began tearing up. The room became darker and darker, the only source of light being the ceiling lamp above Leon. Ba-dump, ba-dump, ba-dump. The sound became louder and louder. It was so unbearable that George put his hands over his ears in hopes of the deafening noise's disappearance. He closed his eyes shut, hoping that it all had just been a nightmare, of which he would hopefully wake up at any moment now. And here you are, still denying it, literally turning a blind eye toward the truth. Ba-dump, 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 ba-dump. Well, guess what? It's time you finally face it, Leon said, as the light above him started fading out. Despite his greatest attempts to shut out every word he had said, and every single heartbeat, of which one turned out to be louder than the other, he finally comes to the only conclusion there had ever been. It didn't work. There was never any cancer, and you know that. Ba-dump, ba-dump, ba-dump. The sound had finally stopped, but what he saw next was even worse than any physical pain he could ever endure. It was suicide, Leon said, as out of nowhere a bright spotlight had been directed towards the ceiling, where a knot that had been tied around a wooden beam could be seen. She told you of every single nightmare and every single sleepless night of torture she had endured, Leon said, as the spotlight slowly moves further down. And you decided to do nothing but to tell her that everything would be okay. Well, does this look okay to you? He asked, as the spotlight finally landed on Cindy's lifeless body. No, I closed my eyes as hard as I could. Why can I still see it? Why can't I get this horrible image out of my head? George cried despairingly. Because you can't erase the past. You did this. You did this to her. You're responsible for her losing her life, you're responsible for you losing your girlfriend, and you're responsible for us losing the best friend we ever had. And you never even cared about how he felt, after everything we did to help you, Leon said, while the group of 3 people emerged from the shadows behind him. No! Exclaimed George. Please, just stop! Stop? Now why would we do that? Asked Leon. After all, the fun has just begun. Giggled all 4 of them in unison. For it's not too late yet, said one of the 3 men to George, suddenly appearing to the right of him, just to fade right away as he finishes. Shocked, George looks to his right, letting out a small gasp. It's not too late to do the right thing, said the woman among them, appearing and disappearing to his left, in the same manner the young man before her had done. George performs another hectic movement to his left. You can still make things right, whispered another one of them from his back, just to fade away in an instant as well. George forces himself to look down where he hoped he wouldn't have to see any more of these creatures again. Little did he know that that may have been the worst decision he had made yet. For as he looked at the ground, he realized that the wooden boards, which were supposed to be there, had been replaced by pure darkness. But strangely enough, he could still see his own reflection. And unfortunately, it meant that he would see her reflection as well. Just as he had come to that conclusion, his very thoughts had been interrupted by a very soft and familiar voice, starting with, "All you have to do." As George began to recognize who that voice, which he hadn't heard in way too long time, belonged to, 2 drops of a black fluid landed on the ground, becoming one with the darkness. Her tears. So that's what I have forced my glance upon, George thought. Hurt by that realization, he began to close his eyes and raised his head slowly. He'd rather endure what these monsters had planned to do with him than to look at the remnants of his beloved humanity. "Is joy in her," said Leon, who had suddenly appeared right in front of George with a wide grin and black eyes, just as he opened his eyes again. Out of nowhere, a red carpet appeared in front of him, leading to an abyss of pure darkness, over which a long rope with a noose at the end is to be seen, just as Leon faded away. Fine. Giving in to the guilt and sadness that George had begun to develop over the years, he began to walk the carpeted way to the abyss. As he took step after step towards the edge, all he could think about was his beloved. Every good time, every bad time. Every time was a great one as long as he could spend it with the love of his life. However, with each step he takes, his memory of his true motives of why he's here in the first place also becomes clearer and clearer, piece by piece, and as he finally reaches the abyss, his arms reaching out to the rope in front of him, he stops. "What is it? Why are you stopping?" demanded Leon to know. The only answer he would get from George being, "I'd be willing to believe anything if it meant I'd see her again." Suddenly, George turns around and runs right through his friends, who had gathered behind him, as if they were nothing. and just like that he keeps running and stops at nothing, up to a point where he was forced to stop. "What the heck is this?" he asked, confused, as he looks upon a maze of mirrors, like the ones festivals he used to visit as a kid had. "I've come this far already, I won't stop now," he continued. It was only after he approached the mirrors further that he realizes the problem ahead of him. He remembered how every time he looked into the mirror he would wish to see Cindy alongside him. And as he looks into the mirrors in front of him, he's disappointed to see that his wish has become a reality. But not in the way he'd wished. In the mirrors he was surrounded by, he obviously saw his own reflection, and sadly, he wasn't alone. Every time his glance had met its mirrored counterpart, he would see a pair of legs, seemingly floating behind him. George knew better, though. He knew they weren't just floating. They were hanging, only letting him see from knees to toes in their reflection. He was positive that if he could see her, he'd also end up hearing her. Scared by that thought, he begins to make his way through the mirrored path, his stubbornness and desperation clinging to the hope that his beloved may still be alive, being stronger than his rationality and common sense. She's still alive. It has to be possible. All of this is real after all, right? They're just lying to me. Right? He thinks to himself as he is slowly losing the grasp of his own sanity. He makes his way through the mirrors, tortured by seeing his beloved's lifeless body everywhere his glance falls upon, and forced to keep his eyes open so he could make out of the maze safely. "All right, you've already done this 1,000 times as a child. All you need to do is always go right," he muttered to himself, unsuccessfully trying to refrain from seeing her reflection. And just as he said, he always turned right, finding himself successful. He hadn't reached a dead end yet. What he had reached, however, was the conclusion that something wasn't right. Filled with pain, he forced himself to look at Cindy's reflection. "It's changed," he whispered to himself, as he sees that the reflection now showed her body from waist to toes, rather than from knees to toes like it had been before. George was shocked. He didn't want to know how much of her he'd have to see before he could finally escape the maze and save her from the clutches of whatever had trapped her here. That fear made him lose the ability to think rationally, and so he started running, crashing through and shattering every mirror that had stood in his way, breaking mirror after mirror after mirror. He had expected it to be painful, but interestingly enough, he hadn't sustained any injuries. After a while, he'd broken through all the mirrors, standing in front of him. All he could see now was a single door in front of him. "This must be where they hid her," he whispered to himself. As he reaches for the handle and pulls it down to open it, a long and slow creak is to be heard during the process. A strange sound from within the room in front of him startled him. "It sounds like a beep," he thought to himself, confused. He opens the door even further and feels a cold gust of air emerging from within the room. He's shocked to see what was inside upon entering the room. In the middle of the room there was a bed, a small body laying on it, his head covered in bandages, an IV drip attached to the body's arm on the left, a small bedside table with a vase containing a few flowers in front of it, and a heart rate monitor to the right. "So this is where that beeping came from," he said to himself, after the monitor emitted another beep. "Just who is this poor kid?" he thinks to himself, as he got closer to the bed.
Quite rude to stick your nose into somebody else's business, isn't it?
Somebody said from behind him. Just as George was about to turn around to see who it would be this time, he felt a sharp pain on the back of his head and fainted. A few hours have passed, and George finally wakes up. Feeling intense pain at the back of his head and a warm liquid, of which he had correctly assumed to be blood, running down his neck, he tried to reach for the injury. Suddenly, a voice that startled him called out,
"Madness. Unfortunately, due to your lack of cooperation, I had to cut the fun short."
The man in front of him kneeled down, his face finally revealing himself out of shadows. "No, it's you. So that's what seemed so off. You said you'd go while you were still sober enough to drive, but there were no sounds of a car leaving the area whatsoever. And the parking lot was empty the whole night, too. I should have heard it," he snapped at the man in front of him, as a sharp metal piece dug its way into his neck, letting out an outcry of pain.
I told you to be mindful of your movements, Sherlock.
The man chuckled, amused by George's pain. "What is this shit anyway?" George demanded to know, still in pain.
What you're in, my friend, is a spring-lock suit designed by my former business partner. Any sudden movements and you're gonna trigger those mechanisms that turn it from suit mode to animatronic mode. And trust me, that hurts like hell.
"You're sick. So everything you told me was a lie?" George asked.
No. As a matter of fact, what I told you is the very reason I am doing this.
The man replied with a smile on his face.
But enough of that. Let's get to what you're here for,
he said, turning the sad smile into a twisted one.
I have something for you. It was quite hard to get my hands on this, but thankfully I was able to find it.
He chuckled again. What are you doing? George asked enraged, while the man triggered some mechanisms around his eyes, during which George was able to locate a weird-looking scar on his neck.
This is to make sure you have your eyes open while you receive your gift,
the man replied.
Now, without further ado, I present to you your prize,
he announced. Congratulations, Gregory. You've finally found me. George instantly focuses his glance to the direction the voice come from, finding himself having to look up yet again. What happened next terrified him, as his former girlfriend's decaying corpse hangs on a rope, some of the organs and bones exposed, an eye missing.
I am really sorry for this. I do not want to do this, but there's no other way. You saw it yourself. My son is dying, and I need your essence to save him,
the man said, his face turning dark. No! 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 George begins to scream, as suddenly the suit he was trapped in begins to shake, the mechanisms all around his body loosening themselves, as they dig right into his flesh, interrupting his painful scream. The only sound to escape his mouth, followed by painful groaning.
Apologies for this too, but it works best if you're in pain,
the man says to George, whose body is covered in blood, which even made its way out of the suit's openings. With his last dying breath, George says to the man, Go, die. The man replying,
I'm sorry to disappoint yet again, but I already have.
Followed by a maniacal, almost painful laughter. The end. Wasn't that a cheery, happy story? And there's a little note here as well. Apparently this is the origin story for Shadow Bonnie. Obviously not the canon one, but it's an interesting little idea. And by the way, if you guys are interested in talking about your theories about this story in the comments, or just your thoughts on the story, I'm sure Jack would appreciate it a lot. So, do that. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for listening. If you want to read the original story, you can do so on the Discord server. And if you want to talk to Jack himself and the other people there, go ahead. And of course, reading the other stories which were posted, which, in my opinion, are also really good. It was really hard to choose a winner. And I might do audiobooks for the other ones in the future. But not yet. I feel like that kind of devalues being a winner then if I do all the others anyway. But maybe sometime in the future, I'll quietly pop up the other ones as audiobooks as well. We'll see. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.